Would you ever join a cult? When you think of cult leaders, mustache-clad brunette men in bell-bottoms come to mind. But what if it was a sharply dressed woman in a pantsuit in an urban area who advertised human connection technology and researched female-centered pleasure and orgasmic meditation? This combo of sex and business wrapped in a wellness package was the right place, right time for the modern-day cult OneTaste and its leader, Nicole Daedone. And the wrong place, wrong time for pretty much everyone else in her path. My next guest is an award-winning journalist who writes for Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Businessweek, investigated OneTaste cult, and wrote the book EMPIRE of Orgasm, chronicling how the sex self-help group twisted sexual abuse into personal growth. Today, she's going to unpack the story and the theater of it all as we ask the question, where is the line between evolution and exploitation? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. Please help me welcome Bay Area native, following the breadcrumbs and decoding reality, Ellen Huet. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Meredith.
I'm so glad we're doing this. Cults are such a hot topic, but they're not usually your topic. You're normally a tech startup. So had you ever even heard of orgasmic meditation before this story?
I had heard of it briefly several years earlier because a colleague of mine had written a story about them, but I was not a reporter covering cults. I was not writing about the wellness industry, and I really was certainly not writing about this particular group either. I was really focused on startups, Silicon Valley, venture capital. I was writing about WeWork, for example.
So what is orgasmic meditation?
Orgasmic meditation, I'll give you the...
I mean, you can't even say it without laughing because it's such a strange, what are we doing?
It is an eye-catching name for a very attention-grabbing practice. So orgasmic meditation is a 15-minute partnered clitoral stroking mindfulness practice. And it was developed and popularized by this group called OneTaste. How it works is there is a strokee, usually a woman, so someone who's going to receive stroking, who gets naked from the waist down, and she lies down on her back and butterflies her knees open. And a stroker, who is usually a man, puts a glove on his left hand and some lube on his left index finger. And for 15 minutes exactly, he will stroke the clitoris of this woman in a very prescribed and gentle manner. They describe it as using no more pressure than you would if you were touching your eyelid. And so he'll stroke her for 15 minutes. And the only goal for both partners during that practice is for them to feel and notice the sensations in their body. And orgasmic meditation is also abbreviated OM. So within the OneTaste world, people would call it Om or Oming, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the idea is that if you do this practice regularly, like other kinds of meditation, you will experience dramatic transformations in your life, that you will have better sex, better relationships, a better sense of your own intuition and desire, more energy and more vitality. And the deeper you get, you will also hear people talk about how Om helped them overcome chronic diseases and autoimmune conditions and things like that.
Oh yeah, one person was like, it healed my Crohn's.
Yes.
It got a little strange. So the part of me that grew up in Nebraska and lives in the South is a little practical. And it's practical in the way that I am annoyed by the $20 drop-in fee for a yoga class. So when I was reading about some of these workshops and their costs, I did not really understand the appeal. Can you talk about those workshops and what they were charging for them?
Yeah. So OneTaste is the business that, it was a wellness startup that was trying to spread orgasmic meditation to the world. That was their mission. Their mission statement was actually, we'd like to bring orgasm to 1 billion people. And their business model was selling courses on orgasmic meditation. So that might often look like a basic intro to Om course would be maybe $150 and would last all day on a Saturday. But it would pretty quickly balloon into, several $100s for a weekend course, or several $1,000s for a week-long course about, kind of the more esoteric philosophies that go along with orgasmic meditation. So the practice was kind of the basic anchor, but there were a lot of deeper and more advanced courses about how to live your life in accordance with the principles of orgasmic meditation and that kind of thing. And those courses could really balloon in price. And some of them cost upward of $20,000. Some of them even cost like $36,000 for a 2-week course in which you got special access to Nicole Daedone, again, the founder of this company. And OneTaste also sold a coaching program, which lasted for several months and cost up to $20,000, in which you could get trained in how to become an OM coach. So that's a business model very similar to yoga teacher training, which has become very popular in the last 20 years. And we can discuss the appeal of why people were taking these classes, but that is the business model that they were functioning under, is selling these courses. But there was also a whole community aspect as well. Like, people who became very involved in this world would also leave their old jobs and start working for the company, and they would leave their old homes and start moving into communal home houses and things like,
Right, because you can't have a cult without that. So when people became members, the other thing that I noticed is that they were, air quotes, encouraged to, quote, practice personal growth activities that got very strange. Can you talk about what some of those were?
Totally. So I'll start with what tends to be appealing to people when they first hear about the practice, and then some of these personal growth activities tend to come after that as you become more involved. So as you described, like, there is something intriguing about orgasmic meditation, right? It is this practice that is devoted to the female orgasm, to female pleasure. And to be clear, within OneTaste, they redefine the word orgasm. So it doesn't necessarily mean the moment of climax the way that we would think of it. They actually use the word climax to refer to that moment. And then orgasm, often written with a capital O in their world, is a more like high-minded erotic energy that can fuel your life. So people will talk about, like, what does your orgasm tell you should do if you're trying to make a decision? Or people would try to like tap into their orgasm to get more energy and things like that. So they would actually compare it to something like the Force in Star Wars. So anyway, the practice of orgasmic meditation is focused on female pleasure. That's pretty rare. I feel like it's just not something that usually is given a lot of attention. And the practice is goalless, so there's really no pressure to like achieve anything in particular. And so for people who might struggle to have an orgasm, or people who struggle with sexual performance or performance anxiety during sex, the goallessness of the practice is really appealing. And then the practice is also explicitly non-reciprocal. Women who receive sexual pleasure and sexual touch during this practice are explicitly told they do not owe their partner anything. Not a phone number, a hug, a handshake, a thank you, more sex, any of those things that we might have been conditioned to expect to owe someone if they give us physical pleasure. And so a lot of women have described to me how revelatory that was. And a lot of men and women who did the practice regularly have talked about how freeing it was to experience that kind of intimacy without the goals and baggage that we usually associate with sex. And then what they were promising as the results of doing this practice regularly, so again, better relationships, better sex, there's a lot of people who want that in their lives, and there's not always clear where to go. So there were people who would join OneTaste who had just gone through a really messy divorce and felt like, I really don't understand how to connect with the opposite sex, and I really want to. And as a side note, like, the organization was also a little bit like leaned heteronormative in its teaching. There was a lot about balancing male and female energies, which is pretty common in like new agey workshops in the Bay Area. But, you can understand why this would be an appealing pitch to a lot of people. A lot of people are struggling with this part of their life. They don't really know where to go. So all that being said, once you get more involved in the community, again, that often looks like leaving your job, coming to work for OneTaste, leaving your home, coming to live in one of these formal or informal OneTaste residences, which they had all around the country. Then you really get immersed in the OneTaste community. And within that world, people who were dedicated members were often pursuing personal growth, that spiritual liberation, sexual enlightenment, whatever you'd want to call it. They were hoping to advance in their lives in this somewhat abstract way. And the teachings within OneTaste, again, they went beyond just how to do this practice. There was also a lot of teachings about how to live your life. And many of them came directly from Nicole Daedone, again, the founder, really the visionary, one might say the guru of this group. And it's really interesting to see how they would use philosophies of what would bring you personal growth, but then they were also like would have a dark side to these practices. So one example is called aversion practice, and this was widely taught within OneTaste. And aversion practice basically teaches you that you stand to gain more sexual liberation and enlightenment and freedom if you partake in sexual activities or non-sexual activities, but they were often sexual activities that you did not want to do, that you felt an aversion to. And you would gain actually, more liberation the more you felt an aversion to this practice. So,
which makes consent so sticky.
It is a complete scrambling of what we think consent would mean, because it means that the way this might play out, and many people have described scenarios to me that they experienced in OneTaste that look like this, where let's say you're like a female OneTaste employee and there are male customers who are signing up for an orgasmic meditation course, but they don't have a partner to try the practice with. And so your sales manager tells you, okay, you should do the OM practice with this person. You should OM with this man. And you do not want to. You're like, I am not getting the right vibe. This is not someone that I want to, have touch my genitals. Then many people have described to me being told, okay, you should do it anyway for your aversion practice. It would be good for you to do something that you do not want because it will help set you free. And people really did want to be experiencing that type of personal growth. So they would often then do something that they did it precisely because they didn't want to. And there was also accompanied by a lot of shaming, according to these former members, a lot of shaming about saying no. So if you were called resistant, that was definitely a bad thing. You would be shamed for being resistant. They even had a particular term for women who said no to sexual suggestions. They would shame them for having a quote unquote golden pussy, excuse my language, but that, within the group, they also had certain in-group jargon like pussy and cock to describe people's genitals. And so, if you were shamed for having a golden pussy, you were like, that was a bad thing. It's good to get out of your comfort zone. I think everyone can agree on that. But then it was very quickly taken to pretty dramatic conclusions within the group. And I think, often quite harmful.
You can obviously see how this would be harmful for the women. You're being assigned, like they would say, a mark. Like they wouldn't even hide it. The people who came in who had lots of money, who were potential recruits, were called marks. I was like, wow, how low key, guys. Great job there. And they would say, make sure that he wants to come back. And it was like they were pressured to go and service him. But the men also had a lot of damage. One of the assignments was they had to go out on the street and tell X number of women their total sexual fantasy. And the end result was they were so used to the rejection and the response of disgust that they became inoculated by it.
Yeah, that was an exercise that was part of a men's intensive. And men within OneTaste were also at times directed to own with or have sex with potential customers, regardless of whether they wanted to. Like male sales employees at OneTaste have described being directed by their managers to go own with women who seemed like they were about to buy a course. And then right after that, then someone on the sales team at OneTaste would call them up and try to sell them something. And so it really did happen to both men and women that they were strongly pressured to put their bodies on the line for the sake of the advancement of the business. And whether they wanted to or not, it was justified by using the teaching principles that were very inherent to the OneTaste philosophy.
Oh, yeah. The whole teaching thing, I think, I'm like, that is way too big of an umbrella because they're like, okay, we're going to teach you. We're going to film you having sex and then we're going to put it up on the big screen. And Nicole is going to critique your technique to everyone in the room. Like, oh my gosh. And then we're going to use fruit, bananas, and half-cut papayas in the laps of our members to simulate oral sex so that you can learn how to do it. And oh God, there was so much there. And I love that you used the word scrambled, because that's like such a good word. Because as I was reading this, I was like, okay, I guess to each their own. Like there's that side, right? To each their own. And then there's the side of like, this is ripe for problems, because they have this idea of extreme personal responsibility, that you had full control of whatever your reality was. And therefore, there was absolutely no victimhood. And we see that right now in the manosphere, the same exact messaging.
Yeah. I think that messaging is so core to what OneTaste teaches and so core to how things can go wrong. And what's interesting is it's actually quite common in many personal transformation, like teaching philosophies. You'll encounter this, if you spend time looking at groups like Landmark Forum or Tony Robbins or these other like sort of heart pumping seminars that get you to transform your life in one expensive weekend. They will often talk about this idea of taking on a lot of personal responsibility for your experience of your life. So within OneTaste, you're right. They would say, you are responsible for how you're experiencing your life. And the corollary of that is, like if you are feeling victimized, well, that's a choice. That's a choice for you to be seeing the world that way. And they would really criticize people who thought of themselves as victims. They would be like, a victim mentality is weak and small-minded, and it was really looked down on. So conveniently, if there are no victims, that means there are no perpetrators. And that means that, if you're feeling harmed, well, guess what? It's your fault.
Yeah. She said, let's make a t-shirt that says, I got raped and all I got was a victim story. Yeah.
And it was fascinating to me and really heart-wrenching to talk to former OneTaste members, as I did for many years in reporting this book, and hear how much work it took for them to get to the point where they could see that, they have been harmed. It was so hard for them to say that about their own experience, because it had been drilled into them so many times that being a victim is such a bad thing. And like, oh, I can't believe people think of themselves as a victim. That's so, that's so narrow-minded. And so for them to finally get to a point where they could say like, actually, no, the systems and the individual people within this community and company hurt me. That was often, it took them years.
This brings up the question, how were they recruiting people?
Here's like a typical pattern. Like OneTaste was started in San Francisco, so it had a quite a big presence there. But as they grew, and they grew quite quickly, they had outposts in cities all around the U.S. and in fact also abroad. So in New York, Los Angeles, San Diego, Boulder, Austin, London, different parts of Europe. They were even in Australia for a while. Like they would set up these kind of regional offices and send OneTaste employees there to try to recruit. And the typical method was by having these like weekly meetups that were free or low cost for like $10 to attend. They would advertise on Meetup, they would advertise online, and people would come in and they would play an evening of communication games. Everyone's clothes stay on, not something too like provocative the first time, but they would play these communication games. For example, one of them is called Hot Seat, where someone is selected to go sit in the middle of the room and then everyone else puts their attention on them and asks questions of them for a period of time. And sometimes the questions are a little suggestive or sexy, but the main experience is just kind of this new, unusual community where everyone seems really conscious and attuned and awake, and they're paying a lot of attention to you. And often the staffers would come up afterward and really try to get to know who you are and like, what's your story? And of course, during Hot Seat, they could also ask questions like, what are you searching for? Like, what is missing in your life? And then if they knew where your vulnerabilities were, then they would try to, coax you in by promising that the community could fix that. And they would also go and set up booths at, some of this was very like 2010s. They would set up booths at like early morning sober dance parties or like the bulletproof coffee life hacking conferences. There was an overlap with certain wellness communities, life hacking, like all, these things that were sort of how to like optimize your life. And of course, then, yeah, 15 minutes to a better sex life or 15 minutes to a connection to orgasm would be part of their pitch. And, people often were just drawn in because the staff that was working sales, they were really coached to just be super friendly, just like exuding a lot of like light and energy and that kind of thing. And for some people it didn't sell, but for a lot of people, like, it did bring them in because it's kind of an attractive experience to have someone pay that much attention to you.
I think if someone was listening to this for the first time and heard that's how they got recruited, I imagine they would still be scratching their head and ask, okay, yeah, but what else? Because if on the surface, that sounds just fine. But when you unpack the mind games that were played by OneTaste leadership, it starts to become a little bit more apparent of how entrapment is the word that comes to mind.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, again, it's like there are a lot of people who joined OneTaste, took a few classes on orgasmic meditation, decided they were complete, left, and went on with their lives. And then for people for whom they were really searching for something deeper, then they would often get involved. And it could happen very quickly. Like, people described to me in a matter of months, really like reshifting their life to orient around OneTaste. It's not about a matter of like intelligence or common sense. If you are yearning for sexual healing in your life, and a lot of people are, and they're often carrying this burden in secret, like maybe you experienced sexual abuse or sexual trauma in your history. Maybe you are one of the estimated 10 to 15% of American women who struggle to have an orgasm. Like, maybe you are someone who really has just felt like you can't get your romantic or intimate relationships to work the way that you want to. Like, that is a big crack in your heart. And then when someone comes along and says, like, this is a community, this is a teaching that is going to solve this, you're willing to, you're willing to try it. And then once it becomes more of your life, once it becomes your job, your home, all your friends, your major like purpose in life, like, a lot of these people truly also believed that they were going to change the world by sharing orgasmic meditation with the public. And so they became inspired missionaries of orgasm, where they were like, this is my purpose, is to share this knowledge with other people. And that is how a lot of cults end up really hooking themselves in people's hearts, is you feel like you are part of a small group of people who have realized some important secret to the universe, and it's like your purpose is to share that with other people. And so, then once you get really involved, then I think the leverage is higher. Like, you can be pressured to do certain things because you fear losing this community that has at that point become your whole life. Like, so it is this process that can happen gradually, but it can be quite strong.
Yeah, because at some point it's sunk cost.
Totally.
Feel like, oh, I can't leave. But
Yeah.
it's important, I think, for listeners to understand there was also like some societal co-conspirators here. Like, this was at the peak of the self-help movement. This is when like Instagram influencers were selling like, you can manifest money, while you're sleeping. And then there was a lot of celebrity endorsements, which is funny because celebrities have their own cult following. Gwyneth Paltrow and one of the Kardashians and the Bulletproof coffee guy, they were all giving their stamp of approval on this product. And so in a way that fast-tracked people's minds, like, oh, I don't need to vet it because this celebrity with whom I already have a parasocial relationship has approved it.
Totally. Yeah. There were a lot of business trends that came together in the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s that helped propel OneTaste, and in particular Nicole, into the limelight as this like mainstream thing. Nicole is a very savvy marketer, managed to take it to the public in a way that people were receptive to. So she had big endorsements from Tim Ferriss. And he wrote like an entire chapter about orgasmic meditation in the 4-Hour Body. You're right that Gwyneth Paltrow eventually endorsed them. She had Nicole be a guest on her podcast. She had Nicole speak on stage at her Goop Health Summit. And then, Khloe Kardashian also endorsed orgasmic meditation, said it was this amazing thing. And yeah, the Dave Asprey, the Bulletproof Coffee guy, was like an ally of theirs. So yeah, if you were in that world of wellness, like these are some of the biggest names that you could want to be endorsing your practice. And more broadly, certain trends like, yeah, the wellness industry was just absolutely bursting during that period of time. Nicole also positioned herself as like a female startup founder in San Francisco. Like that had a lot of cachet. Remember, this is the era of the girl boss and the CEO.
Yes,
And like it was
yes.
cool. You know, people were like, wow, it's cool to see this woman is the CEO of this wellness company all about the female orgasm. That's so progressive. And I think people really wanted to see an idea like that succeed because it feels understandably like a good thing we'd like to cheer for. It's like, yes, like female sexual power, like we love that. But that was also a way that she, you know, got ahead was by people wanting to see like, you know, a female CEO succeed in that way. Also, yeah, so like the startup boom, the wellness world, just this idea that all these things coming together,
The
seminars and
Secret.
courses, The Secret. So another thing that happened within OneTaste is that apart from all this pressure to do certain sexual acts, there was also a lot of pressure to take on debt in order to buy increasingly expensive courses. And part of the rationale for that is Nicole would teach her students things like money is just energy. Money is kind of like third dimensional. Like you don't need to worry about it too much. Like on the fourth dimension, it's an expression of energy. And so there were a lot of people within OneTaste who lost sight of their financial safety and common sense under the pressure to continue buying courses to advance their personal growth within OneTaste. And so again, some of these courses could cost over $30,000 and they would be taught like, oh, debt, it's not that, you know, it's not like debt, there's nothing to be scared of. There were many people who talked about being encouraged to take out credit cards in order to pay for these courses and described this feeling of like, well, once you have a little bit of debt, it's like, then you've broken the seal, then you should just take on more. That also enmeshed them in the company because they were often working for the company, earning money through sales, and then turning around and spending that money back with OneTaste in order to buy the next expensive course. But yes, during this time, that's also like a lot of manifesting ideas were very popular, like in the common discourse. And
Yeah.
people would try to fundraise for courses that they wanted to take using like Indiegogo or GoFundMe and things. And that was part of the culture of OneTaste at the time.
Hey there. It looks like you're enjoying this episode so far. But you know what's strange? Apple tells me that 19% of you who listen on this app aren't actually following the show. To guarantee that we stay connected in this busy world of podcasts, double check that you've hit the follow button on your podcast listening app. And if you have already, I'd like to invite you to my private Facebook group. Just search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes to request to join. It's free. Okay, back to the show. And I think despite all of these very real social ingredients that were present, there's still people that are like, wow, those poor naive people. But as you point out in the book, cults don't look like they did in the 60s and the 70s. And in fact, you say, now they look like mission-driven startups and Fortune 500 companies with demanding schedules and rigid corporate practices. They look like fitness, fads, YouTube, celebrities, altruistic nonprofits, therapeutic psychedelic guides, and executive leadership training seminars. So does this mean that the word cult itself is just too old-timey to be useful anymore?
I have a lot of thoughts about the word cult. Like, I think it's obviously on the cover of the book. It is a useful shorthand for describing to people this idea of a group that, has a charismatic leader and an overarching ideology and increasing demands on your time and resources, like an extractive group that will take things from you if you get too far in. That being said, I really reject too much discussion about like whether a certain group is or is not a cult. I don't think that these things exist on a binary. I'm very against that. And I think when we are asking that question and you end up in this debate that doesn't actually help you understand what's happening within the group, people are trying to get clarity on like, well, is it harmful or not? Well, guess what? Like that's also not a yes or no question. There were a lot of people who joined OneTaste and were not harmed. And there are a lot of people who joined OneTaste and were. And, one of the common misconceptions about a cult is that everyone who was part of it had the same experience. It's really not true. I prefer to have people think about cults as existing on a spectrum, and there being a whole collection of cult dynamics, some of which we're probably familiar with. Again, the charismatic leader, the like in-group jargon, the like separation from your friends and family. Like these things are cliches that we know about for a reason, because they show up in a lot of these high demand groups. And, I would prefer that people just understand that there are a bunch of different characteristics that could coalesce to create like a very dangerous extractive group. And you just need to be aware that they might show up in settings that you really don't expect, at your workplace, in your relationship, in your personal relationships, in your like volunteer group, places that you might not look to. I think certain trends that we're seeing now coming from people who study cults, they say more cult leaders in the future are likely to be women. Like a lot more of them might exist and collect together and gather on the internet. There are a lot of examples in the last 10 or 20 years of people who have gained that kind of influence over people, even if they aren't in person with them. Like they are, broadcasting on YouTube, or they have like online communities, and those can be just as gripping as a group that you meet in person. In my regular work at Bloomberg, wrote a story about people who get caught in delusional spirals after spending many, many hours, days, weeks, months chatting with chatbots, so like ChatGPT and other similar services. And in researching that story, there were people who used the word cult. They would say, oh, this is like a cult of two, like you and ChatGPT, because there are a lot of similar parallels, although you might not expect it. It's like, oh, in talking with ChatGPT, if you end up in this delusional spiral, you have this idea that you've made a huge discovery. All of a sudden you have a purpose, which is to like protect the discovery. You start ignoring outside information and only trusting what ChatGPT tells you. You get separated from your friends and family because you're spending 10 hours a day chatting with a chatbot. And it can be just as devastating as what you imagine, like a typical cult, a rural commune, like a male leader, some sort of everyone's wearing orange. Like that doesn't really exist anymore. We need to be aware that these dynamics are consistent in our, they will show up where humans are, because we're just wired. It's like an outlier of human behavior and psychology. And so it's just going to look different now than it did 20 or 30 or 50 or 70 years ago. And we need to be aware that these images are shifting.
Well, what's concerning is, okay, images are shifting. It's gray, at least compared to the caricature of what cult is in our mind's eye. It probably was gray back then, because back then it was in alignment with like the hippie movement, which had a lot of positive things, So like every decade has its own collection of positive movements that can get messy when humans with control issues get involved. But what is interesting to me is that, okay, these situations require more thorough thought. Like we got to think through these things. Maybe using the cult isn't helpful, but however the process is for an individual, there needs to be a process. At the same time, we are training our brains at a very young age for a 6-second attention span of scrolling. This feels very doom and gloom to me. So I wanted to ask you, what's your take on how people should do a check-in with themselves and assess whether their CrossFit group, their yoga class, their ayahuasca retreat center, how would they assess that? What's the first thing that they should do to see if they are tethered to capital R reality?
What you're talking about with like our increased way of connection being through digital means, or even, it's like social media is no longer something that connects people with other people that they know. It connects them to like parasocial relationships with influencers. All of this, I think, serves to create more loneliness and digital isolation that does make us more vulnerable to groups like this, because they often promise a sense of connection and belonging. And that can be really attractive to someone who does not, just the lonelier we are, the more vulnerable we are. One of the things that you should be really on the lookout for is if a group promises an answer to your problems, that's not necessarily a red flag, but if they also say, we are the only way. And if you do not come with us, you will suffer in some sort of metaphysical or spiritual sense, or like basically if they make you afraid of leaving, that is something that I would consider a big red flag. As soon as it comes paired with this promise that, and if you don't follow this, you'll be doomed, then it becomes a control mechanism. That's my opinion, but I think it's shared by a lot of other people who have studied this. And within OneTaste, that happened. Like, as hard as it might be to imagine it, that was a real thing. I spoke to former members who said that they really believed that once they had started down this path of spiritual growth and personal growth at OneTaste, that if they left and abandoned that path, that they would never find spiritual fulfillment again. So that made the threat all the more scary. And in fact, there's even a video recording of Nicole talking during one of her coaching programs about the name OneTaste. And the name OneTaste originally came from, there's a Buddhist saying about just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so too does the truth have one taste, the taste of liberation. There's a very like elegant origin. But then she was saying to her students, there's another reason we called it OneTaste, which is basically once you get one taste of this experience, like you will always come crawling back. Like you will not be able to be without it, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump into the timeline and start with like Nicole. What was childhood and 20s? I feel like that can explain a lot of people. What was Nicole's childhood and early 20s like that is relevant for OneTaste?
Yeah, Nicole had a pretty difficult childhood. She grew up in the Bay Area and was largely raised by her mother. And her father, who had separated from her mother when she was young, was kind of a absent figure in her life. But he would come and visit her sometimes, and she was very adoring toward him. She has also talked, later in her life about her father being a convicted child sex abuser. And this is something that I spent a lot of time looking into, trying to find court records and things like that to back this up. And it seems correct. Like, he was incarcerated for child sex abuse the first time when Nicole was like in grade school, and then the second time when Nicole was in her 20s. And then he actually died in custody that second time and was never, like, he actually never went through and was like convicted in that one. And it's unclear who his victims are in the first instance. And in the second instance, at least one of them was a 12-year-old granddaughter of his. The big question I had was like, yeah, did this happen to Nicole? Because she sometimes has made hints about it. And I did find people who knew her when she was younger who said that she had told them that her father had sexually abused her. But then later, she also wrote an essay in which she reframed her experience with her father as something that she had wanted and instigated. And keep in mind that at the time that this would have happened, she would have been under 10 years old. And so it's all a bit murky, but it is common for victims of child sex abuse to reframe stories about that abuse to include them having agency in it or having initiative. It is, if you talk to experts who study this, they will say it's really common because it's a way for a developing mind to try to make sense of something really awful in which they felt totally helpless. It is sometimes easier and more palatable, as crazy as it sounds, to be like, and yet like I wanted it, or like I made it happen. And it also, in a dark way, fits into these teachings that were really present in OneTaste about never being a victim, never having that victim mentality. And then her 20s were also this very sort of chaotic time in which she had some jobs that were kind of traditional, like she helped run a art gallery in San Francisco, but then she was also, according to people who knew her at the time, using a lot of drugs, meth and LSD, and working as a sex worker. She has talked a lot about working as a stripper and an escort. Those are the terms that she uses, and how that also shaped her understanding of her erotic and sexual power. So you can start to get a picture of her as someone who embraced extreme positions through, and felt that she had learned through extreme actions. There was a period of time in her life where she talks about living in an acid house, as she calls it, and taking LSD every day. and really sort of frying her brain in a way to like achieve
Yeah.
your consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, when I read that, I was like, Google's how much acid does one need to take before one's brain is mushy?
Yeah.
Inconclusive for those of you that want to know.
Inconclusive, but I think,
Inconclusive.
she, so takeaways from her unusual youth, I think, are that she pursued extreme situations as a way to understand herself. And she would later on prescribe a similar approach for a lot of people. Like decades later, when she was running OneTaste, she would talk about to her students experiments that she had done where she called it like unconditional sex, experiments where she had sex with, the stories differ, but sometimes it's like 200 different people in a year, or sex with a different person every day for a set amount of time. And that helped her achieve a new level of sexual liberation or spiritual growth. And people would so look up to her that she didn't have to prescribe that action to them. They would simply see that she had talked about doing it and assume that it was something that, if they were able to do it too, would help them. So anyway, it's like, I think like her youth sets up this understanding of her as someone who pursues extreme situations to achieve personal growth. And then also someone who really embraced the idea that like being a victim is a choice.
Yeah, she also struck me as someone who might ask the question, I wonder what would happen if, like she lets her intrusive thoughts win, okay? Like, she's like, if I press this pedal all the way to the floor, what will happen, you know? So, yeah,
There's a telling quote from her ex-husband, who she married briefly when she was in, I think, her 30s. And he says something like, Nicole's secret thrill was figuring out what she could get people to do.
Yeah.
So there is, I think, for those who were close to her, they believe there's a part of her that simply enjoys pulling on some strings and seeing what happens.
Yeah. So how did she learn about the idea of orgasmic meditation?
So in her late 20s, she meets a man who she later describes as a Buddhist monk. It's perhaps a bit of an inflation, but she meets a man and he introduces her to a sexuality practice. And it is this practice that is very similar to what will eventually become orgasmic meditation. It's called deliberate orgasm, and it was taught at these two groups that were based in California, that one of them started in the late 60s and the other one was a spin-off of that original group. And they were both also faced their own allegations of being a cult. But basically it was this practice that developed in this small community where it was also like a man stroking a woman's clitoris for spiritual purposes. And they called it deliberate orgasm, D-O. So they would call it like a due date and things like that. So Nicole eventually went and studied for several years mostly with one of these groups and then a little bit with the other, and came to an understanding of like how this practice works, how people might structure a community around the practice, but then eventually decided she wanted to run her own version of it where she was the leader. And these two other groups are run by men. They were really not as business oriented as OneTaste. And so Nicole takes the idea and the practice and starts her own thing, and she like rebrands it as orgasmic meditation. She makes herself the leader and she really positions it as a startup. And I think all those things set them up to have more mainstream business success.
And then in July of 2004, they opened the OneTaste Urban Retreat Center in San Francisco.
That's right.
And you wrote that when the windows were open, people who were walking by on the street below could hear the moans and groans of this orgasmic meditation practice going on. So how was that not flagged as a brothel?
It's funny because since the book has come out a couple months ago, I have occasionally heard from people who read it in part because they worked in that neighborhood in the 2000s and 2010s, and they were always like, something weird is happening in that building. And now I know everything about it. So definitely, if you were in the neighborhood, you probably would whisper about like there's weird stuff happening at like that one building on Folsom Street. And so for those who know San Francisco, it's in Soma, and 15 pairs of people might come together and do the stroking practice for 15 minutes. And then actually people would switch partners and then do it again. So you do 2 sessions in a row. And again, within OneTaste, one of the norms that they really taught was that you should be able to do the OM practice with basically anyone, like anyone who's been trained. It didn't have to be someone that you had a relationship with or that you had any sort of closeness with. It would be more like someone making you a cup of tea. And yeah, people certainly, I think people noticed that, yeah, it was maybe just a small enough practice that it didn't attract that kind of law enforcement attention right away.
I think what you're not saying is because it was San Francisco.
Yeah.
Because, girl, let me tell you, if this was Council Bluffs, Iowa, this wouldn't be happening.
It would not.
Okay.
Yes. San Francisco in the 2000s and 2010s were also, it's always, San Francisco has a long history of being a hub of sexual experimentation. And people were, I think, very open to the idea that, yeah, if there's something a little freaky happening, that like, yeah, San Francisco might be the right home for it.
When did it switch from being a retreat center that people go to a place where people lived and there was like mattresses all over the floor and they slept together like pound puppies?
Yeah. So at sometime in, I think, 2006, so a couple years after they established the center,
Okay.
then they decided to rent the warehouse that was down the block and turn it into OneTaste's first communal residence. This is really the beginning of a whole history of communal living that was really key to the OneTaste community. And at the warehouse, it was not a place designed for living necessarily. So they really turned it into this experiment where they had a big open part of the warehouse where they just hung curtains and they had, over a dozen beds, and they built a loft and had a few more beds in the back. And they slept two to a bed, and there's absolutely no sound isolation. So people have described within the warehouse a lot of sexual experimentation, a lot of oming, a lot of sex, a lot of, shuffling of partners, and you could just hear all of it. So for a lot of people, it was also their first really big experimentation in non-monogamy. There was a lot of jealousy that might come up. And by the way, everyone's like sexual partners, they refer to as research partners, because the idea was that we are pioneers researching like the frontiers of sex. And so people would sometimes be given like assignments to help push their sexual boundaries in the pursuit of personal growth. And it might look like, if you're struggling with being jealous that your partner is like having sex with these other people in the warehouse, that maybe it might be helpful for you to watch your partner have sex with someone else.
Oh my God.
Or if you're having trouble like in a different part of your experience at OneTaste, a common assignment was to have sex with 30 different people in a month, or to give 30 blowjobs in a month or something like that. It was often a certain number for a certain period of time. And the idea was it just created this hot pot of sexual experimentation. And people have also described the warehouse very fondly to me. Like, I think there are some people who had an amazing time and thought it was a really special place.
Well, speaking of communal living, last night, I was like, I don't remember why. I think I was trying to make sure I was pronouncing names correctly, like Nicole's last name and stuff. And that led me to a Dax Shepard interview that you did. And you were like, oh, yeah, my 20 roommates. And I was like, what? So I think we need to talk about how you live in a commune and how your Wi-Fi password is NotACult. That is the password.
We actually really need to change it because it's like
Now everyone knows
now
it.
everyone knows. That was my mistake.
Sorry, I'm contributing.
No, it's totally fine. It's on our to-do list. Part of what made me as a journalist interested in writing this book is because I live a life that is not so far away from some parts of OneTaste. Like, in some ways it's very separate, and in some ways it's more overlapping. I've lived in the Bay Area my whole life. I had, and if you do that, like, you end up attending a lot of these like workshops about authentic relating, like unusual things. I've been to Burning Man, I don't know, 9 times or something like that. And then, yeah, I've also lived communally for many years in different houses. And there's actually a whole network within San Francisco and the greater Bay Area of people who choose communal living because it's more, for them, some people hear about communal living and they think that's my worst nightmare. That's totally fine. It's not for everyone. But for a lot of people, it's like a richer and more socially connected way of living. It's something that I think a lot of people would want if the housing stock made it easier. But it does take a lot of effort to live that way. But it has been a big part of my life. And so I lived in a communal house in San Francisco for many years. Now I live in a different house. It's more of a compound. It has adults and young children as well.
That's so interesting.
But we do,
okay, so
we do not. People are always asking us if we like bed swap, and we do not do that. So it's a little different.
I mean, even if you did, like, that's your business. That's why I think this is so confusing. Like, if everyone is consenting, okay, whatever. But it's like where this element of stranglehold and manipulation and financial pressure and all these other layers of ick come into play. So anyway, let's get back to our timeline. So Rachel Cherwitz, when does she enter the story?
So Rachel Cherwitz arrives in or around 2007. So when OneTaste is just starting to get off the ground. And she is young. She's in her early 20s. And she ends up becoming Nicole's right-hand woman. You know, first she's just kind of like the leader of this small group. And then now she's like the leader of a movement. And, you know, she is taught by one of her mentors that one of the best ways to protect yourself as a leader as you get more important is to make yourself less available and to have someone who can function kind of as your lieutenant and be your protector and your enforcer and all that. And you'll actually see in a lot of cults or cult-like groups, there's often someone who serves that role, someone who is not the leader but is very close to them and can kind of execute on what they want to see done within the group. And Rachel pretty quickly takes on that role for Nicole. The two of them are very close. And Rachel is the head of sales for many years at OneTaste, and a lot of people who worked on sales described both admiring her and fearing her. Like, she was kind of an aggressive person and definitely not someone who held back. And so she loomed large in the experience of a lot of people at OneTaste as the kind of the enforcer for Nicole, and someone who was fully devoted to the mission and purpose of OneTaste.
And that's part of what helped it grow. As you were painting that picture earlier, you know, it had all these locations and they were bringing all this money and it was becoming very popular. But then in June of 2017, Nicole sold her shares of the company to new owners and announced that she was leaving. Why would she leave kind of at its height?
People who were close to her said that she wanted to free herself and free her time to do more teaching and more writing. Other people who knew her described her feeling kind of tired of having to deal with the day-to-day of running a business or being in charge of this. Even after she sold her shares in the company and was no longer technically CEO, she very much has remained the visionary, the like spiritual leader of the group. And even the new CEO has talked publicly about how much, Nicole shapes their vision. Her teachings are everything that they are like centering their business on.
So this brings us to November of 2017, just a few months later, when the new OneTaste leadership hired a PR company to, you know, proselytize the good news of OneTaste. And that ended up in your email inbox. Please tell that story.
So in late 2017, I was working at Bloomberg. I was covering startups. I was based in San Francisco, and I got a pitch about OneTaste. And I get many pitches a day, but this one, you know, as it does, it stuck out. I was like, orgasmic meditation. I've definitely heard of that before. Again, I had read an article written by someone I know about the topic. And you don't really forget the 15-minute clitoral stroking people. You're like, oh, I remember that.
That does stick with you. I can't undo that, Ellen. I don't know if I'm going to thank you or like bill you my therapy costs later.
It's a fun topic to talk about at parties. Like, you know, now you know a lot about them. You can spread the word in a different way. But
gather around, boys and girls. I have a story to tell. How was your day? Well, let me tell you.
So essentially, they were looking for journalists who might want to cover what they were working on, like framed as a fast-growing, woman-led wellness, sexual wellness startup. And I went in and had a meeting with the people who now run OneTaste, and they talked about OneTaste as the whole foods of sexuality. It's like the organic, good-for-you version of sexuality, and how doing this practice can help transform your life. I was intrigued, but I wasn't sure if I was going to write a story, and then I ended up asking around on my own and found someone who had been involved in OneTaste, who had a really bad experience and wanted to talk about it, wanted to talk about feeling like they had been financially exploited and that they felt like it was a pretty damaging group and that that side of the company had not been discussed before. There had been, of course, a fair amount of press about OneTaste. Orgasmic meditation is, a very clickable headline. People are wanting to know more about it. But this was really my first clue that there might be this whole other side of the company. And I ended up talking to many people for over the course of 6 months about their experiences at OneTaste, and they described, again, feeling sexually exploited, like pressured to have sex with their coworkers and potential customers to advance the company, feeling financially exploited, feeling really like having, again, their thinking really scrambled by some of the teachings within the group. And there are people who told me they thought it was a cult and that it deserved that title. And so I wrote a piece that came out in summer 2018 about OneTaste, about these darker allegations about the group. And that really then set off everything that has happened since then, which was like a couple months later, I heard from some of my sources that the FBI had started investigating, that the FBI agents were showing up at their door and asking them about their time at OneTaste. I heard from lots of other people who had been involved in OneTaste and wanted to share their story. That's partially what inspired me to start working on a book about it. And then, that continued on for several years where I was reporting this book and the FBI was still poking around and it wasn't clear what would happen. And then in 2023, 5 years later, federal prosecutors charged Nicole and Rachel with a federal crime, forced labor conspiracy, which is a very specific crime. And then that set off a whole pre-trial. And so then there was a criminal trial in summer 2025 in New York in front of a jury, and it lasted, 5 or 6 weeks. And at the end of that, a jury found Nicole and Rachel guilty. And then the two women were actually incarcerated the next day because they'd been out on bail. And then that leads us to, many months later, they were actually sentenced a few weeks ago. And Nicole was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison and Rachel to 6.5.
Which is not nothing, but a far cry from the 20-year maximum that they could have gotten. I don't want to glaze over the amount of work that you put into all of this. You interviewed over 100 people. You listened to every single podcast, all of Nicole's teachings. I mean, you must have felt like, I cannot shower enough to get this off of me. I was really putting myself in your shoes while reading this and listening to some of the other podcast interviews that you've done. But what I found that, I don't know, maybe is left out a little bit. You touched on it, but it just seems like it would be easy to leave it out of our conversation, and I don't want to, is how much the people who had negative experiences struggled after they left. They often said, you wrote, that they found the regular world so boring and colorless that they craved the drama and the thrill of that communal living situation and the jealousy and the sex and the Nicole's ever shifting moods. And, I don't know. I just feel bad for them.
I think there's a really common experience for people who leave cults or, Heidemann groups, whatever you want to call them, is a sense of feeling isolated and lonely on the outside. So in some sense, some of the fears that get instilled in them while they're in those groups can feel real. Like your friends and family on the outside don't understand what you're going through. You probably have a big, unexplainable gap in your resume. It is hard to get a job. You have to find a new place to live. You have to find a new way to earn money. You feel like you've had this experience. It's really hard to get other people to understand it. They might, your friends and family might be judgmental of the fact that you joined. And even if they want to support you, it can feel like this hard thing. And you just feel lonely. And the rules of life inside OneTaste don't translate well to the rules outside. So there's a story in the book of a woman who had been in OneTaste for several years. And within that world, she had really lived this kind of, according to this philosophy of just sort of believing that they could get away with a lot of stuff, or taking extreme actions, or being, really, I don't know.
Radically honest.
Radically honest in a way that was perceived as rude by people outside. And so she struggled to, work a normal job. And then there's this instance in which she parks her car in San Francisco in the wrong spot and it gets towed. And she does not have the money to get it back from the impound lot. And so she walks into the impound lot, gets in her car, and tries to drive it out of the lot and gets chased by an attendant. She crashes into a fence and she's arrested. And when she's in, held in a cell and is trying to figure out like what just happened, she realizes that she was part of her, like, was just so used to this kind of crazed lifestyle that she was making poor judgment decisions on the outside. And later she talks about, she ends up living with a former OneTaste person as her roommate. And the two of them will sit around and kind of joke, but also it's not a joke, talk about how maybe they need to start another cult because they're bored and lonely and they miss something about that. Even if they know that it wasn't good for them, there's something about it that they miss. And so I think, and then again, people are also grappling with this idea that they believed that if they left OneTaste that they would be lost spiritually. And so there's often a lot of fear and worry and isolation. It can be a very, very difficult experience to go through.
Yeah, I think it's another opportunity for compassion for just the general public, to be compassionate to people who may have those interesting gaps in their life that they're mysteriously leaving out, just to hold that with an open hand, because not only is that a reality for some people, but like you said, they were sitting at the kitchen table going, hey, what's next? And even OneTaste, it's like changed names, right? It's still a thing.
Yes, OneTaste definitely still exists. They do sometimes call themselves the Eros platform now, but they have continued to offer courses. They, in fact, restarted a program that they call CP, which used to stand for the coaching program, which was, again, like one of the central courses that they used to sell. Now they're calling it the connection program, but it's very much hearkening back to the history of the coaching program. And so, they're still offering these courses. Some of them are in person, some of them are online. They have a presence in California and in New York, and they have remained quite defiant about the charges against Nicole and Rachel and the conviction and the fact that their leader is behind bars. They have continued to say that the prosecution is a witch hunt, that is unfair, and they are actually seeking a pardon from President Trump. So that remains to be seen if that will be successful, but that is something that, is part of their legal strategy right now.
Stay tuned. Subscribe to Ellen's Substack to get the latest. Well, as we close out, you gave the analogy in your book about, or maybe it was an interview, I can't be sure, but you talked about the blind man and the elephant. And to me, it seems like the general public consuming the story of OneTaste as a headline, or maybe even the documentary, or just in its partialness, right, is the blind man with the elephant. But you, having done all this research, you see the whole freaking elephant. And I'm wondering, has that changed the way you see society? Do you see it as more frail or more flawed, or what's your take on that?
Well, for those who don't know the parable, it's basically just, like a quick analogy about four blind men who touch different parts of an elephant and come to different conclusions about what the whole animal must be like. If they touch the trunk, it's like, oh, it's this living thing that's like a big snake. Or if you touch the knee or the leg, it's like a tree. And so the idea is that it's a fable that illustrates our natural human tendency to over extrapolate from our own individual experience of something into like a greater truth. I had originally meant it as describing how people within OneTaste who had been members at different times or had different experiences might assume that everyone who was part of this group had an experience that was like theirs. And in fact, that's not true. Like I just at that point had spoken to so many people who had all these different experiences. My hope with the book was to try to represent all of those as responsibly as I could. And I think it has just given me more compassion for the way that different people, and this is not unique to OneTaste, this just happens in life. It's like different people who were in the same room, witnessing and experiencing the same thing, can very much walk away with different stories about what's going on. It's really, humans are narrative-driven creatures. We tell ourselves stories about what's going to happen, about what has happened, how it fits into our lives. We shape the stories of our experiences to match our values or to feel more cognitively aligned. I find that these cognitive habits of ours are really fascinating because they shape our understanding of the world. They shape what we believe to be true. And it shows up so much in everyday conversations about political issues or social issues or things like that. People just come to the table with their own stories about what has happened. So it has given me a more compassionate and expansive understanding of why people believe what they do. It's like often has to do with the stories they tell themselves. And I think that's just a way to understand humans better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for all the work that you've put into this.
Yeah.
The book was excellent. The cover is beautiful.
Thank you.
I think this would be hilarious to read in like a social situation because it says Empire of Orgasm and then the other stuff's kind of small print, just like look over the edge of the book and make strange eye contact. But honestly,
bring it on the subway, bring it on a plane, read it. Yeah, very much with the cover display. That would make me happy.
A crowded jacuzzi full of men. I have done that before.
Nice.
It does work if you would like them to not talk to you. But honestly, so good. Tell people where they can get it and shout out anything else that you want to be sure to help people keep in touch with you.
Yeah, Empire of Orgasm. I mean, I'm really proud of the book and how it came out. I love hearing from readers. So, you can search for Empire of Orgasm. Yeah, Amazon, Bookshop, your local bookstore. Like there's an audiobook version that I narrated, which I had such a fun time doing. So for those who are audiobook fans, I am one as well. And you can hear my voice for 12 or 13 hours for reading this book to you. And then of course it's available on ebook as well. But yeah, please, if you read it and something about it strikes you as an interesting thing, please feel free to send me an email. I love to hear from readers. And I do have a Substack that is not regularly updated, but it will occasionally come through with updates about OneTaste or the book writing process. You can just find me at ellenhuet.com and you'll find it there.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Since you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to be a part of my private Facebook group. In there, I post content that I don't share anywhere else. You can talk to me directly about past and future episodes, and I even do occasional giveaways. Search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes. And if you liked this episode, you'll also like the one that I did with a therapist specializing in helping people deprogram from systems of control. As we ask the question, are political parties basically just cults? That's episode 305. And stay tuned next week when I talk with a PsyOp Army veteran turned founder of the Psy Games as we explore the question, if the world is on fire, is it a luxury or a lifeline to take time to develop psychic abilities? Until then, keep it curious.